I know that you are excited to hear about the new travel mindset, and I think it's always important to start with looking back and talk about where we've been. Now, in early 2020, the Creative Insights team was actually preparing to have this very same conversation with the travel industry, which is really funny. We've come very much full circle. We'd actually spent the latter part of 2019 doing extensive research on the market. We identified patterns in both travel company behavior as well as consumer interest. We'd even begun briefing our contributors to create content that reflected our findings and recommendations. In fact, one of the last trips I took pre-COVID was to Los Angeles to go to a contributor event to talk all about travel. And that sort of behavior, in terms of traveling, in terms of our comfort with travel, was before the pandemic was at an all-time high. We'd actually seen records in the amount of international travel that was being taken on by American tourists, and what that was given rise to, the reason, the kind of drivers behind that explosion was largely attributed to the proliferation of cheap flights. There was this growing middle class, which had more disposable income to dedicate to travel experiences. And there was also the ease and convenience of researching and reviewing and sharing destinations amongst their communities. You can more readily access information about the destinations you wanted to travel to on the internet and via social media. And so it was really driving that increase in terms of international travel. What we also found through our research was that travel was focused on self-actualization. So how do I become a better person through the travel experiences that I am having? So the first thing that we found was that wellness had become the number one priority for most people. It was increasingly front and center in travel values, focusing on both your physical and emotional well-being. Mindfulness had become increasingly popular in terms of a focus with yoga retreats and silent retreats and destinations that were really focused on wellness. But it was also about human connection and how you can, be more fulfilled as a person through the experiences that you had through travel. The other thing that we saw was that many people were becoming more interested in becoming intentional tourists. They wanted to get really, truly localized experiences. They wanted to be culturally immersed and have something that was incredibly unique. And I think there was a lot of different forces. It was like popular culture, books like 1,000 Places to See Before You Die, films like, Bucket List, Anthony Bourdain, things like that. It was created this kind of manic race to visit as many places as possible, as unique a place as you possibly could. And people were really also focused on what we call Instagram envy, where depicting and showing that they could go to certain places out in the world. And it was really also focused on how that represented who they are on their social media platforms. Speaking of social media, another thing that we were thinking about back in early 2020 was, the fact that people, travelers and non-travelers alike, were clamoring for this new sense of what was real. There was a lot of rising demands for authenticity and representation that was driven by the kind of social media as being a great equalizer. And so there was a lot of focus when it came to travel on diversity and inclusion, on being more authentic and focusing on retouched, as well as thinking about how the travel experience can be a little bit more inclusive, from accessibility for disabled travelers, or even showing how people over 50 could be included in the travel experience as well. And popular visuals at the time really represented those values. It was clear that they were exemplifying this bucket list mentality and had a keen interest in this transformational value of travel. So you saw things being popular, like the experience of tourism and where you get to go, and also idyllic postcard snapshots of landscapes, or that Instagram style of creating content where you are putting yourself at the center, taking that selfie or taking a picture of that that food or that thing that you get to enjoy as a consequences of your travel. Another thing that was really popular was the solo adventure. So it was always this kind of very anonymized, semi-anonymized centering of someone from behind in a particular destination that was far flung, or also relatedly destination iconography. So very kind of obvious nods to the destination in question. So for example, Carnival and showing Rio de Janeiro. So that was what travel looked like back then, and and in the early days of 2020. And what we know, and what I know all of you know, is that most travel ground to a halt in early 2020. There was a lot of focus in terms of the government mandates, the lockdowns, the stay home language, like flatten the curve was introduced, and there was so much kind of loss in terms of travel plans, in terms of dollars spent on travel. We had a decline in inbound international visitors. So it was really dramatically shifted the landscape almost overnight. And that was reflected in our content. Unsurprisingly, COVID was immediately top of mind for travel customers, for almost all, but customers from all industries. Especially as the uncertainty mounted and this pendulum kept swinging back and forth between changing guidance from local local ordinances. Back in 2020, things like coronavirus, social distancing, COVID travel, bans, masks, they were all newly significant searches. What that means is that when we normalize for year-on-year growth and search on our site, this rise in interest was statistically explosive. And also, unsurprisingly, safety became this new currency, both for customers and our consumers alike. It was clear that that was the top of mind focus over the next 2 years. In fact, we looked at travel. Oops, sorry. We looked at travel, the popular travel visuals selected by travel brands from 2019 to 2021, and we saw it was over 100% of increase in travel visuals focused on cleaning. We also saw that masks began appearing in a small percentage of travel visuals, and at the same time, these indicators of our new normal showed in what declines in popularity. So we saw less big crowds, less large groups of people, less of that kind of international travel, particularly among American travel brands. And relatedly, people were their focuses were shifting as well. From visual GPS, we found that almost half of Americans say that the safety of a travel destination is now more important than before, and they would actually pay more for a safe and secure travel experience, and that increased significantly from 2019 to 2021. All of that said, safety is just one element of the effects of the pandemic. I cannot stress enough how profound an impact COVID has had on what we value, on what we prioritize. It's affected how we work, how we live, the ways we spend money, how we spend our time, and what we spend our time doing. But that is not the only thing that was on the minds of travelers. And so, with 2 years of lockdown, we had all of this sociocultural upheaval. Think about the Black Lives Matter movement, we had a new president and an election season, and just all of these things that were changing, as well as the economic uncertainty, all of the kind of teeter-tottering of travel restrictions. Our values have really taken on new and different and more fluid shapes than they had before in all arenas of life, but especially in travel. So what I'm going to share is kind of some of these new values about travel today. So the first thing is, a lot of travelers, a lot of today's consumers are reporting moving beyond the bucket list. 71% of Americans formed some new travel related habit during the pandemic, and cost savings and new priorities are at the center in this way that we've never really seen in previous year. Now is really not the time that we want to be spending on that bucket list vacation, on that expensive, very, very expensive dream trip. Only 14% of travelers are interested in that. But does that mean that no travel is happening? So what we did was we looked at where those dollars were going. And so what we found was that while travel spending priorities might have changed, those dollars really didn't go away. They started focusing on who we are and how we live, and what conveniences in our lives that we wanted to introduce. So for example, vacation home purchases grew 3 times regular the average home sales growth. There's a $400 billion dollars spent on home renovation projects. Used car prices, unsurprisingly, grew 40% due to a record demand. And there's more pets that exist in the world, especially beginning in 2020. And so while we're spending less money on trips, those many more people are making investments in other aspects in their homes and their lifestyles. And in terms of what types of travel are still remaining of interest, because travel, again, like I said, has not gone away completely, and there is still some openness to international travel. Over half of Americans have really realized that they could be happy vacationing locally or just staying home altogether. In the next year, people are twice as likely to consider domestic travel than they are to consider a trip internationally. And it's evident that what can be found around them is more important to them than journeys to these big faraway places. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. The other thing that I do want to call out, though, as we think about this kind of desire around travel, is that there is a slight generational travel divide that we've observed in terms of the appetite to travel and kind of the hesitancy that we are seeing. While people of all ages are open to traveling, mostly domestically, people who are in their 60s and 70s, so baby boomers, are a previously prime target for the travel industry due to their high levels of disposable income, their free time, are actually more hesitant than other groups to take on international travel. And there's more openness from them to domestic travel, but that is at a much lower rate than other age groups like Gen Xers, millennials, or Gen Zers. But regardless of age, for all travelers, they've become singularly focused on the why of travel. And for most travelers, reconnecting with loved ones, maintaining those connections, seeing their friends and family is the number one travel preference now. And 40% actually of travelers agree that seeing friends and family is a higher priority now than it was pre-pandemic. And so those values about why they travel kind of shifted. It's not necessarily just about themselves, but about how they can be in relationship to the people that they love. But it isn't just about the why of travel, it's about the how. And so how people are spending their time has also shifted. There is there's this rise in what we're calling workations, where travelers might be taking advantage of the increasing flexibility in their workplaces to take on longer stays while they enjoy new settings. In fact, during COVID, also the average vacation rental increased 18%. And peaked throughout that year. And Airbnb had surveyed their own guests and saw that 60% of guests were either working or studying remotely while traveling, while taking on Airbnb rentals. Where people are traveling to within the US, because remember, it's again, the priority really has been primarily on domestic travel for most travelers, are places that are less crowded and more focused on nature. During the pandemic and even kind of through 2021, US national parks reported an historic rise in visitors, and also a dramatic rise in the range of activities that those visitors are choosing to do once there. They're seeing that, more trail use. They're seeing more camping. They're seeing more backcountry camping, and really is a kind of indicator that the interest in the types of travel that people are seeking are shifting quite slightly. The other thing is going back to what was valuable to back in 2020 for most travelers is this idea of cultural immersion. And actually what we found through our visual GPS research is that it is it continues to remain something important. The experiences that travelers can have while they are experiencing a new destination, things like the food that they eat, the art that they take in, the culture the local culture that they can take in while traveling remains a high priority, as high a priority as it was pre-COVID. That is very much related to diversity in terms of the types of culture that they want to take in, because there continues to be the sustained interest in inclusion, no matter what arena, whether it's travel, whether it's banking, etc. People do want to see themselves in all the things that they might be interested in, all the cultures and communities that might exist out in the world, sort of represented by the brands that they engage with. And that is, they want that to be celebrated no matter, as I said, what industry or arena they are looking at. And that is incredibly important because, travel, what we also know from previous research and that's continuing even today, is that depending on your background, you may have different concerns as you make your travel plans. And you also might have different experiences as you embark on that travel journey. So for example, for Black travelers, they're often fearing racism and thinking about racism when they are making travel plans for new destinations. This is something that, has always been top of mind in this country. Think about the creation and the use of the Green Book, which told a lot of Black travelers pre the Civil Rights Act and even post where they could go safely and where they could stay comfortably, when people were not allowed to stay certain places. That has changed in terms of the fact that, out and out racial violence for the most part is not accepted, and you can't discriminate against a person trying to stay in a particular hotel. And yet those kind of more subtle experiences of racism are still top of mind for a lot of Black travelers, and they report that in how they make their decisions about where to go, even in the US still. But it isn't just about Black travelers. Asian travelers are also feeling increasingly unsafe due to the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. They're thinking about where they can go safely without experiencing any sort of experiencing violence or any sort of discrimination. Travelers with disabilities also experience high rates of discrimination while they are traveling. And that is at every point in the travel experience. They have to think about, accessibility. They have to think, especially if they have mobility disabilities. There was a study done where they looked at discrimination by TSA agents at airports, and they found that disabled travelers reported still continuing high rates of discrimination, but by those agents. Additionally, airlines and accessibility for through hotel experiences are also something that travelers with disabilities have to think about. And last but not least, and this is not, again, exhaustive of all underrepresented identities, just a sampling. What we did find is that 80% of LGBTQ travelers are continuing to rank the friendliness and the acceptance of LGBTQ people as a top consideration when selecting a vacation destination. Think about everything that's going on in the legislation right now in different states in the United States right now. This is something that is top of mind, and does inform decision making when you have certain identities. And why that's important is that people are especially looking for recognition from travel brands to explicitly address and demonstrate their commitment to social causes, their commitment to inclusion, their commitment to diversity, and recognizing that people from all different backgrounds may have different experiences when it comes to traveling, both domestically and abroad. And the last thing that in terms of values that I want to kind of draw your attention to is the fact that from our visual GPS research, what we also look at is image testing. And we kind of want to understand what about certain images are resonating most with consumers. And what we discovered is that in the US, consumers were overwhelmingly gravitating toward visuals that not only show diversity in an everyday situation, but also feel more accessible, feel authentic, feel feel natural, like pictures that they might take of themselves. So they're looking to see themselves at the center. They're looking for it to feel natural and to reflect their values and reflect them as they truly are. And so that is something that's that we need to bear in mind, and actually we're going to be thinking about as we go on to the next section. And so what we looked at was, what patterns do we see in travel visuals now, that travel visuals that were selected by travel brands within the last year? Are these new values and behaviors being reflected? And if not, how can we bridge that gap? How can we continue to make visual choices that are going to connect and resonate? So the first thing that we looked at was, in the last year, the journey of travel actually has been really top of mind and the primary focus for most popular visuals in that last in the last 12 months. There is a focus on reflecting the ways we travel now, which is very heartening. We've seen growth in all types of road trips, for example, families taking road trips, couples taking road trips, but also individuals taking road trips, which to us is a clear indicator that there is an understanding of the ways in which most consumers today are approaching their travel plans. At the same time, other popular travel options are seldom seen in popular visuals, though many people of all backgrounds, especially when traveling domestically, tend to utilize different modes of travel. So think train travel, think bus travel, especially when there are limitations based on budget, based on income. And so you're not necessarily always seeing that kind of diversity of modes of travel being depicted. The other thing thinking back to what was most popular back in 2020 and late 2019, which is the style of imagery focused on this really, really postcard idyllic landscape shots. And this remains in high demand for travel brands today. At the same time, thinking back to what consumers are asking for or clamoring for is kind of bringing themselves to the center of the imagery. So how can we both center these really beautiful landscapes that represent the kind of diversity and topography of the United States, the diversity of destinations in the United States, but bring people more to the center of those visuals? That's probably an opportunity for us. The other thing that we saw and uncovered through our looking at popular visuals from 2019 to 2021 was the many microcultures of the United States not necessarily being shown in the ways that we know that they exist. So we saw that there was a decline over the last 2 years in this focus on depicting culture and cultural experience, even though that has remained a top priority for most consumers as they make their travel decisions. And when they are showing American culture, there are things like stereotypes like football and burgers and cowboy hats, which might be one element of American culture, but it is not representative of the diversity of the United States, where we know that there's so many different cultures and communities that exist, and also so many different pockets. This is a very large country that has different, as I mentioned, different topography, different cities, small cities, big cities, sprawling plains and ocean cities, et cetera. And so we want to show the different ways culture might show up based on those different pockets of the US. And it's especially important as we know that drive to exploring culture is really, really incredibly important when it comes to travel. What we did see, though, excitingly, is that popular visuals are reflecting a shift to more representation of certain communities. So you're seeing, more 18% more people of color than you did 2 years ago, which is really heartening. And in particular, you're seeing a lot more Black people, a lot more in terms of specific racial identities, a lot more Black people, a lot more Asian people, even a lot more Latinx or Hispanic people in visuals. You're also seeing more LGBTQ people over the last couple of years, and also more disabled folks over the last few years. So in terms of by the numbers, that diversity in travel visuals has improved. And yet, while that diversity has improved, those stereotypes, there's still some stereotypes that we want to be cautious of. that may persist, especially as it relates to travel. So for example, you are seeing more Black people out in nature. You're seeing them more frequently depicted engaging in outdoor pursuits. But white people are still seen the most frequently in terms of adventure or nature travel. And many other racial ethnic groups are left out even further. Asian people, for example, are seen 7 times less, and Latinx people or Hispanic people are seen 10 times less. And so there is still kind of an archetype of who does adventure, who goes out and enjoys nature and hiking. The other thing is that LGBT, looking at specifically in more detail the representation of LGBTQ people, that has increased quite significantly. But LGBTQ travelers are often defined by their identity alone. 1 in 3 travel visuals showing an LGBTQ person often shows pride flags. 1 in 5 are portraits, which means you don't really get that same depth of storytelling. You don't get them placed in context of what they're doing or enjoying on their travel experience. And then there's very, very little popular travel visuals that show LGBTQ people traveling on their own, rather than instead they're often defined by who they're partnered with. Also within the LGBTQ community, because it doesn't just look at sexual orientation, it does look at gender and gender identity. The number of trans people shown in travel visuals has increased 411% since 2019. But they are still not seen in kind of a diversity of different types of experiences. They're experiencing similar rates of kind of exclusion or defaulting to certain scenarios like portraiture or showing only the flags, only pride flags. And although, and non-binary travelers or other gender non-conforming travelers are not shown at all, and they're even though they are the most frequently worried about discrimination while traveling. And then the last group that we had looked at was people with disabilities, and we are showing a growth in that, and yet we're not really showing accessibility, which is something that is super top of mind for people who are traveling when with a disability. So how do travel brands connect using visuals? There's so much to take in regarding what are driving people's decisions now, what people are valuing now. Our values have shifted quite significantly over the last 2 years, and yet some things have really remained the same. The fact that people want to travel and see themselves reflected while they're traveling and while they're being kind of targeted through advertising has remained the same. Connecting travel as transformation actually has remained the same. It's just that the connection, the drivers behind it might be shifting. And we know that it's important to think about this because I know you all know that travel is bouncing back. After Omicron subsided, and somewhat, well, fingers crossed, knock on wood, we know that more Americans are committing to travel plans, and actually the pandemic is not influencing their decision to travel as much as it did in previous years. There are these concerns, these ambient concerns about convenience and about getting the virus out of traveling, needing to quarantine and people being, concerned about how that gets handled. But ultimately, the majority of consumers are weighing the benefits, and they are saying that they believe that life is short and that they shouldn't postpone taking the trips that they want to take and having the experiences that they want to get out of travel. So what we know is that, travel on its own, it might be challenging right now, but it is worth it for so many more people than we might think. The values might change, the logistics might have changed, but this desire to be reflected authentically has not. And, when we think about what the ways in which we can connect, the ways in which we can demonstrate that we understand what we consumers are thinking about now, visuals are such a powerful tool, as Paige has shared, in connecting and really representing the audience right now. And so we have a couple of questions that you want to ask yourself as you're making decisions about travel visuals, and just thought starters as you're creating new content, embarking on new campaigns. So the first question is, do your visuals reflect the truly reflect the ways that we travel now? Does it consider safety alongside the elements of destinations that motivate travelers? Things like connection, but also things like culture and convenience and the benefits that people get and are looking for in travel now. And speaking of the benefits, are you remembering that togetherness is really the ultimate driving force of travel right now? Together, rediscover connections between family, friends, and other loved ones. And then when you are depicting those things, are you showing, the emotions, the activities, the settings? Do those things depicted feel genuine, and authentic? Just because we're talking about a particular type of imagery, a particular scenario, does not mean we throw out the need and the desire for authenticity. And then speaking of authenticity, are you making sure that you are showing the diversity of today's travelers across backgrounds, across incomes, across interests and different cultures? Are you also at the same time being inclusive and avoiding stereotypes while you're depicting underrepresented travelers? Are you making sure that your diversity and inclusion commitments are not separate, a separate campaign, a separate initiative? It is embedded into all the choices that you're making when it comes to travel visuals. And last, but certainly not least, are you making travel personal? Think about how you can bring forward an idyllic landscape, but put people at the center. Are you showing travel's transformational value again in that way that is authentic and is genuine and ultimately will resonate?